There's a profound paradox unfolding at this very moment in the financial capitals of the West. If you monitor the trading terminals in Manhattan, institutional portfolio managers are quietly celebrating nominal highs in equity valuations, seemingly insulated by the perpetual expansion of fiat liquidity. Yet, if you shift your gaze to global maritime choke points and the sovereign storage facilities of the East, a starkly divergent reality is taking shape. Nation-states are not accumulating paper derivatives. They are aggressively, systematically hoarding physical barrels of crude and metric tons of foundational agricultural commodities. In a highly financialized system, we often confuse the speed of transaction with the presence of actual underlying assets. The effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz this April of 2026 is currently being sanitized by mainstream financial syndicates as a transient supply chain disruption, a temporary friction that will soon be smoothed over by diplomatic normalization. This is a deliberate miscalculation. What we are observing is not a logistical anomaly, but a forced, permanent restructuring of the global energy architecture. We are definitively exiting the post-war era of frictionless, just-in-time logistics, subsidized by maritime hegemony, and entering an epoch of localized physical scarcity where sovereign power is measured not by treasury yields, but by tangible stockpiles. To comprehend the sheer macroeconomic gravity of a paralyzed maritime artery, we must discard the daily news cycle and examine the historical mechanics of a self-destructive demand shock. In 1807, attempting to maneuver through the geopolitical crossfire of European conflicts, President Thomas Jefferson enacted the Embargo Act, effectively sealing American ports from international shipping. The executive intent was diplomatic coercion. The economic reality was immediate, systemic asphyxiation. By artificially severing the physical supply lines, the Jefferson administration did not merely halt international commerce, they engineered a catastrophic liquidity freeze within the domestic economy. Official American export revenues evaporated by 80% within 12 months. The most critical financial lesson to be extracted from 1807 is not the collapse of macroeconomic aggregates, but the violent, instantaneous transfer of pricing power. When critical supply arteries are clamped, the utility of fiat currency aggressively decouples from actual purchasing power. During the embargo, the nominal wealth of coastal merchants holding paper credit became mathematically irrelevant. Instead, those individuals and entities possessing physical, inelastic commodities, raw materials, imported staples, and tangible energy sources suddenly became the undisputed arbiters of value. A top-down geopolitical mandate inadvertently stripped leverage from the financial class and handed it directly to the pragmatists holding physical inventory. Today, that exact mechanism of fiat decoupling is being replicated, not on the eastern seaboard of the United States, but on a planetary scale. The monetary establishment prefers that you fixate entirely on the spot price of crude oil, subtly suggesting that the systemic damage is quarantined strictly within the energy market. But if we trace the thermal output of those stranded hydrocarbons just one step further down the industrial supply chain, we uncover a secondary contagion that central banks are entirely powerless to print their way out of. That contagion is the absolute weaponization of our global caloric baseline. The financial press is currently saturated with meticulous calculations regarding the percentage increase at the local petrol station, obsessing over the rising cost of the daily suburban commute. This represents a profound misallocation of analytical focus. The true systemic vulnerability facing Western economies does not reside within the internal combustion engine. It is buried deep within the agricultural supply chain. We are witnessing the activation of the Haber-Bosch trap. To comprehend the sheer gravity of this mechanism, one must strip away the abstract financialization of commodities and examine the raw industrial chemistry of modern civilization. The Haber-Bosch process, the industrial methodology for synthesizing ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen, is critically reliant on natural gas. Crucially, natural gas does not function merely as the thermal energy source to power the industrial reactors. It is the fundamental chemical feedstock providing the hydrogen required for the molecular synthesis. Currently, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer produced via this exact energy-intensive pathway is responsible for sustaining the crop yields that feed approximately 50% of the global population. It is the invisible, hydrocarbon-based scaffolding that supports all modern demography. Therefore, the concept of a standalone energy market is an academic fallacy. The energy market and the food market are functionally synonymous. When the maritime flow of Middle Eastern hydrocarbons is abruptly choked off, it triggers an immediate mathematical repricing of global agricultural inputs. We are already observing this structural shift materialize in the commodities sector. By the first week of this current month, April 2026, global urea futures, the primary international benchmark for nitrogen-based fertilizers, violently breached the $700 per metric ton threshold. This is not a transient speculative spike driven by high-frequency trading algorithms on Wall Street. This is a 70% structural surge since the beginning of the year, driven by the physical unavailability of raw feedstocks, and the stark reality that the choked maritime choke points process a massive fraction of the world's seaborne fertilizer. The baseline cost to cultivate the foundational elements of the human diet has just become prohibitively expensive for a significant portion of the global agrarian sector. Faced with exorbitant input costs, the mathematically rational response for commercial farming operations worldwide is to drastically reduce fertilizer application. This inevitable reduction guarantees contracted crop yields in the upcoming harvest cycles, engineering a severe, unavoidable supply-side deficit. We are staring directly into the abyss of textbook agricultural stagflation, a simultaneous stagnation of economic output coupled with soaring, inescapable costs for basic human sustenance. This is classic cost-push inflation, operating entirely outside the jurisdiction and control of Western central banking. The Federal Reserve possesses the regulatory authority to manipulate the overnight lending rate, and they can continuously expand the M2 money supply to monetize federal debt. But no central banker, regardless of their academic pedigree or institutional mandate, can print synthetic nitrogen. You cannot deploy monetary policy to circumvent the laws of thermodynamics, nor can adjusting the federal funds rate conjure missing physical gas shipments. As the institutional realization sets in that upcoming caloric inflation is mathematically immune to domestic monetary intervention, sovereign nations are quietly abandoning the charade of paper markets to aggressively secure their physical survival. And when we peer beneath the geopolitical surface to audit the actual physical hydrocarbon reserves currently held by the world's supposed superpowers, the true, terrifying asymmetry of this new order is laid bare. For the past half-century, the architecture of American geopolitical hegemony has been deeply intertwined with the mechanics of the petrodollar. We engineered a system where the global south extracted physical resources, and we exported fiat currency. It was an elegant, highly profitable equilibrium, provided the maritime arteries remained open and unquestioned. But the moment physical friction is introduced into those arteries, such as the current operational paralysis in the Strait of Hormuz, the fatal flaw in prioritizing digital wealth over tangible stockpiles is mathematically exposed. Let us examine the empirical data provided by the United States Energy Information Administration this very month, April of 2026. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, theoretically designed as the ultimate sovereign insurance policy against systemic shocks, currently holds approximately 401 million barrels. This figure represents less than 60% of its maximum capacity. In practical terms, against the backdrop of our current consumption rates, this provides roughly 125 days of net import cover. We are operating a global superpower on a physical margin of error that would be considered financially negligent for a mid-sized logistics corporation. Now, contrast this vulnerable posture with the deliberate long-term geopolitical calculus executed by the East. While Western financial institutions were aggressively deploying capital into tech valuations and virtual assets, Beijing was quietly executing the most massive transfer of physical wealth in modern history. By December of 2025, they had systematically accumulated an estimated 1.4 billion barrels of crude oil, securing it in sprawling, strategically hardened storage networks. This is not merely a disparity in storage capacity, it is a fundamental paradigm shift in the definition of sovereign wealth. We are witnessing the definitive transition from a unipolar fiat-based architecture to a multipolar, commodity-backed reality where national security is strictly correlated with physical inventory. This sovereign pivot carries direct, immediate implications for your personal balance sheet. The brutal reality of logistics dictates that when maritime choke points are fortified and global supply lines freeze, holding billions in treasury yields or digital bank balances becomes a profoundly irrelevant metric of power. You cannot combust a treasury bond to generate thermal heat, and a robust brokerage account will not power an industrial generator when the municipal grid fails. At the absolute apex of systemic friction, the only currency that retains unquestioned utility and absolute liquidity is physical. It is the liquid propane, securely stored in steel cylinders that performs reliably down to negative 42 degrees Celsius. It is the high-density kerosene, capable of burning for 45 hours per liter, safely warehoused away from direct sunlight. The East understands this. The institutional money that is quietly exiting the paper markets understands this. Yet, while sovereign states and systemic observers pivot violently toward tangible accumulation, the vast majority of Western households remain hopelessly tethered to an increasingly fragile infrastructure. They have outsourced their physical survival to a digital mirage that requires continuous, uninterrupted baseload power to merely exist. And one must ask, when the physical hydrocarbons required to sustain that power grid are suddenly trapped thousands of miles away, exactly how quickly does the illusion of digital wealth evaporate into the reality of localized darkness? The empirical answer is precisely 12 to 24 hours. We are not forced to hypothesize about the timeline of this collapse. We possess empirical data from recent localized stress tests on the Western grid. During the infrastructure failure triggered by Hurricane Beryl in Texas in 2024, and again during the synchronized grid collapse across Spain and Portugal in 2025, the vulnerability of our digital ecosystem was starkly quantified. The modern financial apparatus, from high-frequency trading algorithms down to your local grocery store checkout, relies on the continuous transmission of data through cellular networks and fiber optic lines. When the primary municipal grid fails, these data arteries are sustained temporarily by localized battery backups at cellular towers. Once those cells are depleted, typically within that 24-hour window, the cloud ceases to exist in the physical realm. This creates an immediate macroeconomic phenomenon that most financial advisors systematically ignore: the state of zero liquidity. In a fully functioning economy, wealth is measured by nominal value. In a compromised infrastructure scenario, wealth is measured strictly by transaction capability. When point-of-sale terminals go dark and the ATM networks lose connection to their central mainframes, a fully funded checking account containing 6 figures possesses exactly zero liquidity. Your digital fiat becomes a theoretical abstraction locked behind an impenetrable wall of dead pixels. The formal retail economy instantly shudders, and the transition to an informal decentralized market is both violent and absolute. In this localized informal economy, physical paper currency immediately reclaims its historical monopoly as the ultimate medium of exchange. The individual holding a structured 2-week reserve of small denomination physical notes transitions from being an antiquated skeptic to possessing absolute purchasing power. While neighbors stare blankly at non-functional credit card terminals, the holder of physical cash navigates the emergent peer-to-peer economy, securing the remaining inventory from independent vendors who can no longer process digital authorization. However, even physical currency is subject to the unforgiving laws of supply, capable only of purchasing what remains available in the immediate geography. True sovereign independence at the household level requires possessing the microassets that secure biological baseline survival when municipal services inevitably degrade. When electrical pumping stations fail and municipal water pressure collapses, as documented heavily during the consecutive Cuban blackouts of 2024 and 2025, the utility value of a 0.1 micron gravity filter, such as those engineered by Sawyer or LifeStraw, eclipses any financial derivative. By neutralizing bacterial and protozoan threats from compromised water sources, this single piece of physical technology prevents the rapid gastrointestinal illness that ravages unprepared populations. Furthermore, this physical portfolio must account for asymmetric information and physiological degradation. When mobile data saturates and broadband internet vanishes, the only remaining vector for critical logistical data, evacuation routes, supply distribution points, and systemic updates, is the electromagnetic induction of a hand-crank AM/FM radio. Concurrently, anticipating the failure of temperature-controlled supply chains, the strategic acquisition of World Health Organization standard oral rehydration salts becomes a non-negotiable medical hedge. These meticulously formulated ratios of sodium, potassium, and glucose cost fractions of a cent to produce, yet they become the defining differentiator between manageable discomfort and a secondary, fatal health crisis when local urgent care facilities are overrun. You have established localized power, you have secured purified water, and you possess absolute liquidity in the informal cash market. But as the systemic friction drags from hours into days and supply chains fail to replenish, a much darker mathematical principle begins to govern human behavior. That principle is the absolute inelasticity of demand. In a functioning frictionless economy, consumer behavior is dictated by substitution. If the price of premium beef escalates, the consumer seamlessly pivots to poultry. If civilian airfare becomes prohibitive, the population chooses domestic travel. That is the definition of a highly elastic market. But when a systemic shock violently severs the supply chain of baseline physical necessities, thermal energy, clean water, and dense caloric sustenance, that elasticity instantly drops to zero. When an individual realizes that municipal water pressure is not returning, or that the local supermarket cannot restock its shelves because diesel reserves are depleted, their demand curve becomes perfectly vertical. At that precise mathematical coordinate, price ceases to be a consideration. A population stripped of fundamental biological inputs will exchange any amount of nominal fiat currency or endure any level of risk to acquire a single 20-pound cylinder of propane or a sealed container of uncontaminated water. The sudden vanishing of these items from retail shelves within the first 72 hours of a crisis is routinely mischaracterized by mainstream media as irrational panic. It is not panic. It is a hyper-rational, instantaneous market recalculation by individuals who suddenly understand that the supply curve has functionally shifted to zero. For decades, the financial and political establishment has actively pathologized the accumulation of physical goods, labeling those who secure their own supply chains as paranoid or extreme. And this psychological conditioning serves a very specific purpose. It ensures a population remains entirely dependent on centralized distribution nodes, making them infinitely easier to manage and monetize. But as a sophisticated observer of macroeconomics, you must decouple your strategy from media narratives. The strategic acquisition of mylar-sealed, oxygen-deprived agricultural commodities, the stockpiling of temperature-stable medical kits, and the maintenance of physical energy reserves is not a retreat from reality. It is a calculated asymmetric hedge. You're simply reallocating a fraction of your fiat portfolio into hard, physical utility. The downside risk of this trade is a marginal loss of storage space in your home. The upside is the absolute preservation of your household's sovereignty when the structural integrity of the just-in-time delivery model inevitably fails. The global energy architecture is currently undergoing a violent geopolitical repricing, and the cascading effects of the Haber-Bosch trap are already actively eroding the purchasing power of your remaining capital. The Federal Reserve cannot mandate agricultural yields, and quantitative easing cannot manufacture synthetic nitrogen. Real wealth, in the paradigm of 2026 and beyond, is definitively measured by your proximity to and ownership of the tangible assets that sustain human civilization. Do not rely on the sanitized inflation metrics published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to gauge the severity of this transition. The most accurate macroeconomic data is empirical, and it is located in your immediate geography. I am asking you to conduct a localized barometer check this week. Visit your local hardware retailer or bulk supplier. Check the current price and, more importantly, the physical inventory depth of standard steel, propane cylinders, and bulk, non-perishable proteins. Report your findings in the comments below, including your state or region. We are bypassing the manipulated consumer price indices to build a real-time, unfiltered macroeconomic heat map of our domestic supply chain integrity. The numbers you see on the shelves today are the most accurate leading indicator of the crisis tomorrow. Manage your assets accordingly.